Hello and welcome to the Broker Podcast. With me today is Michael Potter with 3 questions to stump your broker. Mr. Potter, what do you got?
Yeah, hello, Jack. It's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Yeah, first question that we have on today is I have a question about how compensation between brokers actually works. If there's no MLS offer of compensation, or if one broker doesn't agree with the amount being offered, how is that handled? Does there have to be a written compensation agreement between the brokers before the deal closes? And what is the best way for agents to make sure these agreements are in place?
Yeah, well, that sounds like a question that is pre-August 17th, 2024. There is no offer of compensation, as you know, from the MLS, the NAR settlement agreement. So there is nothing. There is no agreement in the MLS. The MLS is only a syndication engine for displaying information and syndicating listing data to different sites. For the brokers to agree on compensation, at least in Texas, we have a Form 2402 that is designed to put an offer of compensation together in writing for a specific property. And so it's tied to that particular property at that particular transaction. If that transaction closes, the brokers will agree to compensation. My recommendation is that when an agent is working with a client, they go ahead and pick up the phone and call the listing agent and ask them if the broker is offering cooperative compensation. If they are, then go ahead and get that document signed. They should certainly get that document signed at the time of offer or before, because after the offer is signed, there's no reason for the broker to make good on the offer of compensation, although that offer of compensation is coming through the MLS, or rather coming through the listing agreement. So the seller has already agreed to offer cooperative compensation, but it's an offer and you have to accept the offer. And how you accept that offer is by getting an agreement signed between brokers that formalizes that agreement. Now, real estate, we've got the 4 contracts you should know: the buyer rep agreement, the listing agreement, the contract, and the independent contractor agreement. So we are a contracts type profession, so agents should be securing their compensation. It's not that the seller is paying the commission to the broker, it's that the buyer is paying the commission to the broker and the seller has agreed to reimburse the buyer for their buyer broker fee.
So what would happen if, let's say for instance, the broker fee that the representation agreement says is at 3%, and the listing, when we call the listing broker, they're only offering 2%?
Okay, so despite being the same brokerage, we always want to use X%, but I think what you're saying is what happens if the buyer rep agreement is for more than what the seller is offering through cooperative compensation. So in a situation like that, then you've got several options. It's first not up to the broker, it's up to the client to decide how they want to address that. But it's up to the buyer agent to advise the buyer of what their options are. So before they tour that property, it's part of the fiduciary duty for the buyer agent to let the buyer know what cooperative compensation is, if any, how much it is, and if there's a delta. And if there is a delta, disclose what that delta is. Now the agent and the buyer gets to take that piece of information into consideration on either whether they want to move forward with that property, whether they want to negotiate that delta in paragraph 12 of our contract, or go back to the listing agent and ask for more. There's nothing wrong with negotiation, because everything in real estate is a negotiation. When we had the MLS offer of compensation prior to August 17, 24, part of the rules and regs said that we would not go back and renegotiate the seller side commission. But when those rules went away and when the MLS is no longer an enforcement engine for compensation, nothing stops them from renegotiating the listing agreement. But we really have a better mechanism in paragraph 12 to do it, because that's the buyer and the seller negotiating that between themselves. And in a market like we have today, October, hence Halloween today, October 2025, we are in a type of market where it's likely that a buyer is going to get closing costs paid and
Hmm.
negotiate the buyer broker fee. So, the answer is they negotiate it. But the buyer has to be aware of it so they can take that piece of information into consideration when it's time to negotiate it.
Well, thanks for that clarity. Let's move on to our second question. This one, I'm pretty sure a lot of agents wonder. So, when a buyer asks for repairs after the inspection, what is the best way to structure that request to protect both sides?
Hmm.
For example, should we be listing specific repairs, requesting a credit, or asking a licensed contractor to perform the work? And what are the most common mistakes agents make during this part of the negotiations?
First, I think that we should be encouraging the buyer to get an inspection on every transaction.
Hmm.
And if the buyer chooses not to get an inspection, we have a specific form, at least under our brokerage, that waives any liability from the broker. Because sometimes you're working with an investor or someone who's savvy, and then they don't want to do an inspection.
Hmm.
But that can come back to bite you later when they find some type of major situation going on with the property that they felt like someone knew about, and now they're grasping at straws and someone else's fault, and they're trying to find out who it is. And so we want to cover ourselves and reduce the risk of liability to everyone in the transaction by encouraging inspection to happen. When the buyer orders an inspection, they should be letting the buyer know that they're hiring the inspector, and the inspector is someone that they need to interview to do the job so that they can build a relationship between the buyer and the inspector so there's some confidence there.
Hmm.
And we're going to recommend that the buyer show up the last 15 minutes of the inspection. We don't recommend that the buyer get there 4 hours early and be sitting on the seller's furniture and spending 4 hours in someone else's home. But we do want them to show up at the end so the inspector can walk the buyer through the property and show them the major concerns. One of the things I think really the buyer agents really need to hear is that if the property has dirty carpets and the walls needs to be painted, uh, things that you can visually see, unless there was a change in condition of the property since they put in the offer, they negotiated those deficiencies with the purchase price. The inspection is supposed to find hidden faults, things you couldn't see with the naked eye. So then you're going to the inspector and saying, what'd you find? What's going on with the property that I need to know? Because now they're going to have a full picture, at least a better picture of what it is that they're buying. Major mechanicals, shingles on the roof, things like that. So then the inspector is supposed to walk the buyer, and I do recommend that the buyer agent be there, not to be inserting themselves in whether or not a defect or perceived defect is a major issue or not, but so that the buyer agent can have some understanding of what's going on because they're likely going to be the ones who are going to be negotiating this. But the inspector needs to be able to walk the buyer through the property so that the buyer feels pretty confident in what they're going to do. Either jettison their way out of the transaction, or that they're going to ask the seller or move forward without asking for any repairs, or they're going to maybe ask for repairs or a repair credit. Now, I think at the end of the day, what the buyer wants is to be able to move in and start enjoying their home on day one. So it's not a bad practice for a real estate agent to ask the seller to advise the buyer that maybe a good practice would be to ask the seller for a credit. That way, we can close the transaction and the buyer can hire someone that they choose. When a seller is moving out of the property, oftentimes they're going to find the cheapest person they can find to do a repair on the way out. And they're certainly not going to use the same care in fixing it as a buyer would on the way in. So sometimes just giving them a credit, which would allow them to apply to the closing costs, which is usually the best way. They're going to have a down payment and they're going to have closing costs. And so if there's a $1,000 repair and the seller gives the buyer $1,000 credit, it means that they're going to bring $1,000 less to the closing table, meaning that $1,000 is sitting in their bank account and they can use that to go ahead and hire the person that they trust that's going to give them a warranty that if the situation or the repair isn't done to their satisfaction, that they can continue working with that person to get it there. So asking for a repair is never a bad idea. But first, the buyer really has to have a good understanding of what it is that they're buying. And that
Mhm.
comes between them and their inspector. It should not be that the agent sits down with the buyer and goes through the inspection report and says, okay, what do you want to do here? The buyer should have a very good understanding of what's going on with the property because they hired someone to do that job. They
Mhm.
hired someone to advise them on the condition of the property. So now it's how do we want to address the issues that are present with the property that you're not comfortable moving forward with, your deal breakers. So, do you want to ask the seller to make a repair? Sometimes a buyer's going to want to ask for repairs. But if they do ask for repairs, it needs to be on a repair amendment. It needs to be clear. It needs to be concise. And it needs to have a measurable uh, end point. At what point, what needs to be fixed, and what are you going to consider a repair complete? If there's ambiguity, you're going to be in a nightmare scenario because the buyer and the seller is never going to see eye to eye on what the quality of the end work is going to be. Especially on the listing side, if you're representing a seller, you and I,
Mhm.
have had situations. Michael is a team lead here at Realty Texas. We have seen situations where what was negotiated through a repair amendment was see attached inspection report. And the outcome of that is a mess because now you've got multiple people involved trying to figure out what does that even mean? See attached report, fix
Mhm.
everything, and fix to what level. So that's very, very dangerous. So agents, they need some competency on this. They need to have a mentor walking them through the first few transactions, helping them understand the repairs process better. But out the gate though, the agent needs to introduce the buyer to an inspector or inspectors for them to interview and hire, build that confidence and build that relationship between those two, have the home inspected, and then the inspector go through the inspection report with the buyer. The buyer have a good concrete list of what they're looking for, and then now the agent and the buyer are going to sit down and say, okay, are we going to ask for specific repairs or are we going to ask for a dollar amount? It's really not up to us to make that decision
Mhm.
because we are uh, a profession that gets paid for our advice and our recommendations. And at no point is a buyer required to follow our advice or our recommendations. And so they may choose that they want the seller to make the repair. They may be thinking, maybe if they uncover something that there's going to be a can of worms that gets put into this, and they want any ancillary issues that are found through that inspection or that repair rather to be fixed as well. So, I think that the repairs portion and the inspection portion is a major part of a home purchase. When the
Mhm.
buyer takes that first stroll through the property, they don't really know what to look for. Sometimes the real estate agent can look around, they can see things that the buyer doesn't see. But in Texas, we have an option period. I think one of the other mistakes that agents make, common, is that they ask for too compressed of a time and an option period for a buyer to
Mhm.
get the property inspected so they really do have an understanding of what it is that they're buying. If there's a pool or a septic tank or a sump pump or a property that's got special improvements that it's going to take multiple inspections to really inspect that property, or even just there's been a recent hailstorm and we want to make sure that we have the shingles evaluated, and it's going to take 3 or 4 days to get maybe the adjuster out or an inspector out to inspect the roof, which would be a roofer at that point, that we need 7 to 10 days. I see often buyer agents wanting to get through and trying to compress this timeline to 3, 5 days. I don't think that that's likely enough, even on a just traditional home that is sticks and bricks, no pool, nothing. But you get those more complicated homes with a lot of improvements. They need more time to be
Mhm.
able to evaluate that home.
Yeah, and that actually brings us right into our third question.
Okay, I know the second one was a long answer,
No,
but
no.
it's a big topic.
Well, there's one thing that you brought up in there that I thought was quite interesting is that the buyer gets an opportunity to see that property ahead of time. So they have an idea of what the carpet looks like, how the paint looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. So they should negotiate it from that standpoint. And the inspector is looking for things that they can't see.
Yes.
I think that's very important for agents to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you brought that up. But speaking about option periods, so the third question that we have today says, I have a question about option period extensions.
Mhm.
If a buyer and a seller agree verbally to extend the option period, but the amendment doesn't get signed until after the deadline is already passed, what happens? Is the buyer still protected, or does missing that deadline mean they've lost their unrestricted right to terminate?
That's a good question. I think a lot of newer agents sometimes get this wrong, and they get it wrong because paragraph 5, earnest money and termination option, has a space between when the contract is negotiated and the effective date is entered, and the 3 days from the effective date to the deadline to tender the checks for the option period to have an option period to begin with. The deadline is midnight 3 days later, and then you enter the option period, and you're entering the option period for a preset negotiated amount of days until its conclusion, which ends at 5 o'clock on the last day. And if the last day is a Saturday, a Sunday, or a legal holiday, it extends to the next day that's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday in paragraph 5, as it says. But I think that what agents think is when they're dealing with an extension that 3 days still applies, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
To properly extend an option period, you use the Texas or the TREC amendment, and on that amendment it says buyer has paid seller, which means it's past tense. And so in order to extend, the buyer would have had to pay the seller directly, and that money doesn't go to the title company like it does the initial option period. In the amendment, it says that it goes to the seller, and so they have to tender that money to the seller before the option ends. Because if the option ends and they don't have an extension signed and the option fee paid prior to the extension of the first option period, the option terminates and it's done. And there's no way to resurrect it. So it's very dangerous for an agent to, to not read the language that they're advising their clients on. Because if you read the language of the contract, it's very clear with no ambiguity. Buyer has paid seller, which means past tense. There is no such language that gives them a 3-day period to get the checks in. And so if you want to extend, you got to extend and give yourself enough time for that extension to really happen. Because if the buyer and seller agree to something verbally, you memorialize it and make it a contract by getting it signed.
Mm-hmm.
Texas real estate, it says that all agreements have to be in writing where possible. And if there's a form for it, we have to use it. And so to get their actual agreement on this, there should be an amendment signed. And it should be, the payment should happen first. Now, I'm going to say that if the buyer and seller agree to this, and you have emails going back and forth, and it's 4 o'clock, and the buyer agent is on a ship somewhere, and the listing agent is, out of pocket, and the buyer and seller through email agree to extend, and you have that in writing in an email, and they Zocom or Zelle or Cash App money from the buyer to the seller, I would say that you have an agreement. And I would say that agreement would stand. But that is a very unique situation. And it would all have to have taken place before the 5 p.m. deadline. But best case scenario, I would say that would likely be a fiduciary failure, or at least a mistake made by the agents, because you should not be still negotiating your option at 4 o'clock on the last day. If you have clients who have not come to an agreement the day before the last day, you should already be talking about an extension to give everyone the space that they need to make a decision on the most colossal purchase of their lifetime.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I see that happen every once in a while, to where we are negotiating at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's not a fun place to be.
No, it's not, because it puts the clients in jeopardy.
I mean, the amount of anxiety that it creates for the buyer, for the seller, for the agents, everyone's hair is on fire. The transaction is falling apart. The seller is concerned now because maybe they've already made a purchase decision. Maybe they've got earnest money out. The buyers, everyone is just in an uproar. And all could have been avoided by, number one, the agents picking a longer option period to begin with. Mm-hmm. So you had a few more days. And then when you kind of see the cracks in the wall and you kind of have an idea that they're not coming to terms with what's going on, get it extended. Mm-hmm. And I think listing agents should be maybe not pushing the agents to pushing back and saying, no, we don't want to extend, because you are putting the transaction in jeopardy. You really are, because you're likely to get a termination. If a buyer is feeling like they're backed in a corner and they don't have an opportunity to really to understand what it is that they're buying, they got two choices: take a risk, take a gamble, or bail. And likely they're going to take an offering.
That's a lot of good information. One of the words in that amendment where it says that the buyer has paid, does that also mean that the seller can say doesn't have the option to say no to the extension?
Well, so just because a buyer sends money to the seller, that doesn't create the extension. The seller and buyer agreeing to the extension by signing the document. That is what formulates the actual agreement of the extension. So it does say it has paid. So it would be that the buyer is going to send the seller some money and say, for this consideration, I would really, really appreciate a couple more days. And then the seller and buyer sign the amendment. So that is the spirit of it. That's what's trying to be accomplished. And if the seller refuses, then I would argue that money should be returned.
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, if we have time, I got another bonus question here.
A bonus question.
And going on that, because we see this happen every once in a while as well when it comes down to option. And sometimes we see buyers, agents and buyers trying to extend an option period for $1.
Yeah, that's true. We do.
Yeah. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Texas Realtors completely did a 180 on this. And it was like 2012. They had the centerfold edition of the Texas Realtors magazine. Had this big centerfold 2-page, and I still got a copy of it because I use it sometimes, that says all of the rules about how you extend an option. And back then, the option all went to the seller. It didn't go to the title company. And there's some stuff in there that's changed. But on the second page at the top, it said that you should not extend the option for what would be considered a token, something that is just for appearances. So they said that it's likely that if this were to go into the hands of a judge and an attorney in litigation, that they would say that's likely that there is no option, because an option, people deal in options. Option is a whole other practice of law that is inserted into our contract. And it is the buyer buying the property for a preset price for a preset number of days. And during that option, they have the unrestricted right to terminate and walk away. They're buying that right. And likely, if they were to get into a lawsuit over this, and it was for a nominal amount like $1 or something that's a token, it's likely that a court would say that they never had a valid option in the first place, because it wasn't enough to substantiate what it is that they were actually buying. So our job is to create a bulletproof contract to limit the risk of the parties involved. And so the advice that we give them should not be advice that is littered with risk, but it's advice that should lower the risk. So our advice should be, let's take what the original option was, dollar amount divided by the number of days you had, and look at that as your per diem, and multiply that by the number of days you're asking for to be safe. That's a rule of thumb. But you're right. You cannot extend for $0. And if they do extend for a nominal amount like $1 or $5, it's likely creating a lot of risk for the buyer. And if it does turn into risk and they didn't have an option period and that advice came from the agent is now carrying that risk and liability through their insurance at the brokerage.
Yeah, I think that helps clarify that a little bit, because we do see that a lot. And that is all the questions that we have for today.
Nice. Well, thank you all for showing up to our broker podcast. If you have any questions that you want to put in Michael Potter's list so he can pull out of the hat, go ahead and just go down to the bottom, click comment, and add your comment. And as always, thank you for showing up to the Broker Podcast. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Have a great one.
You did that in the last video, and it was perfectly timed, so I thought we'll do it again.
It did. It works.
Yeah.
I like it.
Fun questions.
Yep, those were some good ones, I think. And we'll figure out the next one. I want to send out an email to everyone and solicit their questions and get them all on board on this.
In the team sales meeting, in the YPN group. But I feel like that because this is so easy, this doesn't take anything, that we can do more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we can.
And 29.